The road curved gently around the base of a low hill, dust clinging to the edges where wild grass had been beaten down by tire tracks and summer heat. The man walked slowly, carrying a canvas bag slung across one shoulder, his boots quiet on the gravel. Evening pressed in from behind the trees, the kind of stillness that only comes before the first stars arrive. A shape caught his eye near the ditch, low, dark, unmoving. At first, he thought it was a piece of tarp or wind-blown cloth caught in the bramble, but as he moved closer, he saw it shift slightly. A dog, lying in a nest of crushed weeds and dry earth, half-curled, ribs lifting barely with each breath. One leg splayed awkwardly behind him, fur caked with dried mud and something darker. The man stopped where the gravel met the grass, hands loose at his sides. The dog didn't lift his body, didn't try to move away. Only his head rose, slow, deliberate, and his eyes met the man's. Not wide with fear, not hollow with pain, just still, watching, as if he'd been waiting for someone to stop. The wind moved the tall weeds, brushing over the dog's back like fingers. His fur was thick but patchy, curled at the ends like it had once been soft. The man took one step forward and crouched, lowering his body slowly. Speaking in a quiet voice meant more for the air than the animal. "Easy, boy." The dog blinked. His breathing stayed shallow, chest barely rising. There was blood dried at the corner of his mouth, not fresh, but not old. His front paw twitched, then folded back under his body. The way he was lying, it hadn't been sudden. He'd chosen this spot. Or he'd made it as far as he could and stayed. The man opened his bag and took out a folded rag, poured a little water from his flask into the cloth, and held it just above the dog's reach. The dog didn't move, only his nose quivered once, then stilled again. The man placed the damp cloth on the ground and stepped back, waiting. It took nearly a minute before the dog moved. First the nose, then a slow stretch of his neck, and finally his tongue reached out, brushing against the edge of the cloth. He licked once, then twice, then stopped. The effort had drained him, but he hadn't looked away from the man. There were no homes nearby, no sound but the insects humming in the grass. The man scanned the fields and tree line, no collar, no sign of a crash or fall. Just the slow dusk, the quiet dog, and the faint scent of dry earth and old blood. He moved a little closer and gently lowered a hand near the dog's shoulder, not touching, only offering. The dog flinched but didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a soft sound, low and breathless. Not a whimper, more like a sigh pressed through pain. The man whispered, "You hurt bad?" The dog's head lowered to the grass again, eyes still open. A fly buzzed near the wound on his hind leg. The man waved it off, then finally let his hand rest lightly against the fur on the dog's neck. The skin twitched, but the dog didn't resist. His body was warm, shaking but warm. He could see now that the dog had been there for more than a few hours. The grass beneath him was flattened with the shape of his body, the soil compacted into a shallow cradle. A trail of paw prints, barely visible, led from the far edge of the ditch, where the embankment dropped down sharply. Maybe he'd fallen, or maybe he'd climbed out of something worse. "Where'd you come from?" the man murmured. No tag, no lead, and no smell of smoke or oil that might suggest he'd come from a wreck. The man stood and looked down the road. His own house was another mile off, behind a low fence and a row of tamarisk trees. He looked back at the dog. He knelt again, this time sliding his arms slowly under the dog's shoulders. The dog let out a short, tense breath, but didn't snap or pull. His body was limp, but not lifeless, more like he'd run out of resistance. As the man began to lift him, the dog twisted suddenly, a low grunt pressed from his throat. His back leg kicked once, a weak protest. Then his body stiffened, and he pushed back out of the man's arms, not to fight, not to flee, but to stay. The man tried again, softer this time. The same result. The dog refused, not out of fear, but insistence. He pressed his weight downward, jaw tight, chest against the ground like something anchored him there. The man sat back, puzzled. He set the rag down again and watched as the dog reached toward it, just a little. Then rested his head on the earth, breathing slow. A choice. A waiting. In the distance, a pair of crows circled and called out. The sky darkened a shade further, painted with soft lavender and thin orange streaks where the sun dipped low. The dog hadn't taken his eyes off the man since he'd arrived. The man took off his coat and laid it across the dog's back, careful not to press. The dog didn't move, but when the coat settled, the dog let out a long, deep exhale, as if the moment was no longer his alone. He stayed there with him, watching the light fade. A car passed once, far off, tires humming like wind. The man didn't wave, didn't shout for help. Something about the silence felt right. He didn't know yet what held the dog to that patch of earth, or why his eyes had locked onto his the way they had. But there was something unspoken between them, a tether not yet understood. By the time the stars began to blink through the blue, the dog had closed his eyes, not in pain, just resting, still breathing, still there. And the man stayed beside him, coat over his body, a hand resting in the grass. Some moments arrive quietly, and some stay with you long after the road has gone dark. By morning, the ground was cool with dew, the kind that beads on leaves and soaks into cuffs. Mist hung low across the grass like a second breath, quiet and slow. The man returned just after dawn, his boots darker now, softened by moisture, steps slower than usual. He carried a shallow bowl, a towel, and a small tin of soft food warmed by the walk in his coat. He'd thought the dog might be gone, slipped away in the night, or pulled back into the brush by pain or instinct. But the shape was still there, curled in the grass, half covered by the coat he'd left behind. The dog stirred at the sound of steps, not startled, just aware, his head lifted slowly, jaw tight from the strain, ears twitching once. The eyes that met the man's weren't dulled by the night. If anything, they were clearer, awake, with purpose. The man knelt, holding out the bowl, but the dog didn't lurch forward. He waited. Then, after a long pause, eased one paw forward and dragged himself closer. Not a collapse, not a stumble. A crawl, careful, chosen. The movement was stiff and jerky. His hind leg dragged uselessly behind him. A torn muscle or fracture perhaps, but it wasn't bleeding fresh. His chest trembled with effort, tongue slipping out between breaths, but when he reached the bowl, he didn't rush, just dipped his head, licked twice, and paused, as if he didn't want to take more than necessary. "Easy now," the man whispered. "We'll go slow." He reached out again, resting a hand against the dog's shoulder. This time the dog didn't resist. But when the man tried to lift him, the reaction was the same, a sudden stiffening, a low sound, not pain but warning. The dog pushed his weight downward, chest pressing hard against the earth. So the man stopped. He sat beside him, eating nothing himself, just waiting. And when the bowl was empty and the silence returned, he rose to leave. He moved a few steps toward the road, glancing back once, and the dog began to follow. It wasn't fast. Each movement took effort. The good front leg pulled, the broken one lagged, and the back limbs shuffled in uneven rhythm. But he moved, crawling, breath shallow, dirt catching in the folds of his fur. The man turned, unsure. "You want me to follow?" he said gently. The dog stopped, looked up. then moved again, just a few feet. Paused, looked back. His eyes said enough, so the man turned and followed. They went that way across the edge of the field, not far from the tree line where the tall grass bent from old wind and morning frost. The man moved slow, stopping when the dog stopped. He didn't lead, he waited. It was almost 20 minutes before the dog turned off the flattened path and pushed into a thicket. The man hesitated, then crouched and moved aside the branches. Behind the bramble was a small hollow, a depression in the land no wider than a cart, ringed with weeds and broken branches. It might have been overlooked 100 times by someone walking nearby. But inside, there, in the dry leaves, was another dog, smaller, thinner. Fur pressed flat along the ribs. Eyes barely open. She didn't lift her head at the sound. Only her ears shifted toward the man's steps. The male dog stopped at the edge of the hollow and lay down, sides heaving, chest rising and falling fast. He didn't move toward her. He just looked back at the man and waited. The second dog let out a sound, faint, raspy, more breath than bark. Her limbs didn't move. Her coat was rough, streaked with soot and sap. She had the same shape to her muzzle, the same dark fur around the eyes. Younger, maybe a sibling, maybe not. But there was something shared in their stillness. The man knelt between them, unsure of where to begin. The second dog didn't pull away, but didn't rise either. Her body was too thin, too spent. She watched with dull eyes and shallow breath. He set down the towel first, then reached for her gently, pressing fingers behind her shoulder blades where the bones jutted sharp beneath the skin. No growl, no flinch, just quiet surrender. "Okay, girl," he murmured. "We'll take it slow." One arm around her middle, the other beneath her chest, he lifted her carefully and wrapped her in the towel. Her weight was barely more than the cloth itself. The dog beside the hollow stirred, making a low chuffing sound from his throat, not protest, but recognition. When the man turned to go, the male tried to rise. Legs failed beneath him. He tried again, this time dragging himself forward with front paws, chest scraping dirt. The man stopped. "You can't walk that far, not like this." But the dog kept coming, inch by inch, eyes never leaving the girl wrapped in cloth. So the man lowered her back down just for a moment, sat beside her, waited again. A quiet wind moved through the trees, brushing leaves against each other like dry pages turned slowly. A crow called once in the distance, then silence again. Eventually the dog stopped crawling and simply lay beside her, his head touching her flank, his chest pressed lightly to hers. The man looked at them both, then reached again, not for one, but for both. The girl he cradled in arms, the boy he wrapped in the coat once more, this time lifting from beneath with more effort, supporting the legs that no longer held. He carried them in shifts, a few steps, then rest, then again, back across the grass. Across the edge of the field, past the place where the bowl had been emptied, and onto the road where his truck waited, parked under the tamarisk trees. By the time they reached shelter, the sun had climbed above the hills. Light spilled across the path in golden silence, catching in the fur of 2 wounded dogs, each too tired to speak, too trusting to run. He didn't know their story yet, what storm or cruelty had brought them here. But he knew this. The first dog hadn't wanted rescue for himself. He'd waited for someone to come, but he wouldn't go until she did. The wind had shifted by afternoon, warmer now, carrying the scent of cut grass and the faint tang of wild clover from the hill beyond the fence. The man moved carefully, one hand on the dog's back as they stepped out beyond the shed. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, his legs uncertain, each step made with intention more than strength. There was no leash, no harness, just quiet trust and the slow rhythm of footsteps through grass. It had been a full day since the man carried him home, wrapped in an old coat, laid him on a folded blanket in the garden shed, and waited. At first, the dog had barely moved, but that morning, as light filtered through the cracks in the wood, he stood, shaky, silent, then pressed his nose against the door and looked up. So the man had followed. They crossed behind the fence and over the old embankment, where the land opened into wild pasture. A place the man hadn't walked in years. The kind of forgotten field that grew what it wanted, milkweed, thistles, yellow aster, their tall stems swaying against the dog's sides as he moved. There was no rush. Every few paces the dog paused, nose to the ground, then turned his head to make sure the man was still there. His ears flicked back each time he heard his boots catch on stone or weed, and then forward again, resolute, guiding. The man said nothing. He just walked, letting the dog choose the path, letting the silence carry them both. It wasn't far, perhaps a quarter mile, maybe less, but with each step the dog seemed to slow, like something in him was pulling toward a place his body wasn't quite ready to reach. They came to a stand of low trees, their trunks leaning toward each other as if sheltering a secret. The ground here was uneven, softened by erosion and fallen branches. Just beyond the largest trunk, the dog stopped. He stood still for a long moment, chest heaving lightly, then took 2 more steps and dropped to his belly. His head turned back once, then forward again, eyes focused on a patch of brush nestled between 2 mossy rocks. The man knelt beside him. At first he saw nothing, just tangled roots and dry leaves. But when he shifted a branch, the shadows moved, and something within them stirred. A second dog lay pressed against the base of a fallen log, barely more than a silhouette in the dark. Her body was curved inward, limbs folded tight, as if trying to disappear into the soil itself. Fur matted and thin, bones pressing sharp beneath the skin. One eye blinked, slow and dry, and the other remained closed. She didn't lift her head. Her breathing was faint, uneven, like a broken rhythm trying to find its beat again. The man leaned forward and placed a hand on the ground, palm open. She didn't react. The first dog gave a low, quiet sound, not quite a whine, more like a breath laced with memory. The man reached forward, gently moving the branch that covered her flank. He could see now how small she was, young, maybe 2 years old, with delicate limbs and a narrow chest that barely rose with each inhale. There was no wound, no visible injury, just exhaustion. Starvation. His voice was almost a whisper. You stayed with her. The male dog didn't move, just watched. With slow fingers, the man brushed debris away from the young dog's face. Her ear twitched slightly, then settled again. He unrolled a clean cloth from his bag, slid it beneath her slowly, careful not to pull or press. She was light, shockingly so, and still warm. That was something. He folded the cloth over her ribs, shielding her from the wind. As he prepared to lift her, the male dog rose again. His legs trembled under his weight, but he moved forward on instinct, placing his nose lightly against her side. She didn't respond, but his tail flicked once, just a soft tap against the ground, and stilled. The man carried her close to his chest, wrapped in wool and silence. He looked back at the male, crouched low in the dirt, eyes fixed on the spot she'd lain. "You coming?" he asked. The dog didn't answer with sound, only movement. One step, then another, a dragging paw, a determined crawl. The man waited, and when they were both ready, they left the hollow behind. The way back was slower. The girl dog didn't stir, her body slack against the man's arms. But the male moved with more urgency, as if now that the moment had passed, now that she had been found, he could let go of caution and hold on to hope. When they reached the fence line, the man unlatched the old gate and passed through first, then stood aside. The dog followed on his own, tail low, fur catching the light where the sun slipped between clouds. He paused once more at the threshold of the shed, as if unsure. The man didn't call, just stepped inside and set the girl down on the soft bedding he'd laid earlier that morning. He draped a second blanket over her and filled a bowl with warm broth from the pot, still simmering on the hot plate. The male entered finally, slowly, nose lowered to the ground. He walked to where she lay and settled beside her without a sound, their bodies touching again, as if no time had passed since the last. She didn't open her eyes, but her ears moved once, and that was enough. The man sat quietly against the wall, watching the two of them. No questions left his mouth. No answers were needed. Whatever their story, it had been written in silence and carried in bone. Out in the pasture, the wind shifted again, and the branches above the hollow swayed back into place, covering the ground with shadow once more. The place he'd led the man to was not a place of fear. It was the place where he'd waited, where he'd kept her warm, where he'd held on, until someone finally came. The shed behind the man's home was built long ago, meant for tools and harvest crates, now softened by time and quiet. Dust settled on the old shelves, and a thin line of daylight cut through the warped wood slats. In one corner, where hay once lay piled, he spread two thick wool blankets over a bed of dry straw. The dogs had been here before, briefly, but now they returned together, one in the man's arms, the other at his heels. The young female hadn't stirred during the walk. Her body stayed limp, eyes closed, wrapped tight in the towel the man had carried from the hollow. She weighed almost nothing. Her chest rose faintly, just enough to let him know she hadn't slipped away. He laid her down first, easing her gently into the bedding. The wool beneath her held warmth from the morning sun, and when her side touched it, her legs twitched once. A small breath escaped her nose, a soft rasp of air, not quite sleep. The male stood just beyond the doorway, leaning slightly to one side, tail still. His ribs showed now in full light, a tight ladder beneath his skin. The coat draped around him had slipped to one side, and the man reached to straighten it. The dog let him. "You did good," the man said, his voice barely above the hush of leaves outside. He prepared warm broth in a shallow bowl, breaking up bits of softened bread into the liquid. The scent filled the shed, mild, comforting, the kind of smell that reminded the man of old winters and careful hands. He placed the bowl in front of the male first. At first, the dog did nothing, but then, slowly, he lowered his head and sniffed. A few hesitant laps, then a pause. Then again, he wasn't ravenous, he was careful, as though he'd learned not to trust full bowls anymore. The female opened her eyes only once, for a moment, when the man shifted the blanket higher along her shoulder. Her gaze didn't hold focus, it fluttered past him like light through smoke. She didn't move again. The man checked her paws for wounds, cleaned the dried mud from between her toes, and wrapped her front legs loosely with soft bandages soaked in balm. Her pads were cracked, likely from weeks without shelter. He worked slowly, talking to neither of them, but never in silence either. The shed darkened as the sun dipped behind the hill. A faint orange glow filtered through the dusty glass of the side window. Insects hummed beyond the boards. Somewhere far off, a train passed, its low rumble barely brushing the edge of the quiet. The male had finished half the bowl and now lay beside the girl, his body curved gently toward hers. His head rested on her front paw, his eyes half closed, not asleep, but still. She hadn't shifted position since he'd been brought in. But as night came, something changed. Her tail moved. It was the smallest thing. A tremble, really. Just enough to brush against his. He didn't react with sound, didn't rise or wag. He simply moved closer, his shoulder pressed to hers now, and his breath adjusted to match her rhythm. Shallow, slow, synchronized. The man watched from his place by the doorway. He hadn't turned on the lantern. There was no need. The light was fading, but the moment didn't ask for brightness. He laid one more blanket over them both, careful not to disturb their arrangement. The fabric softened the edges of their shapes, curling around their sides like early fog across a field. For the first time since finding them, the man stepped away. Not far, just to the porch where the wood creaked under his weight. He sat with his back to the wall and closed his eyes, letting the last warmth of the day rise through the soles of his boots. Inside, the dogs didn't move. The female still hadn't eaten, but she was warmer now. Her breaths had steadied. Her tail remained against his, and her ears, once folded back in silence, twitched softly with the sound of his breathing. It wasn't a recovery. Not yet. It was something quieter. Not survival, but presence. Two bodies, once separated by pain and hunger, now curved into each other like roots beneath soil. Unseen but unbroken. And on the old wood floor of the shed, beneath a tangle of wool and quiet air, one life sheltered another. Night fell without ceremony. Crickets began their slow chorus. The trees leaned in the breeze and the stars blinked above the field where only hours ago she had been fading alone. Now she was not alone, and neither was he. The rain came gently that morning, tapping soft rhythms on the metal roof of the rural shelter. Not a storm, not even a full downpour, just the kind of steady drizzle that deepens color and hushes the world. The trees outside stood soaked in silver light, their bark darkened, their leaves heavy with quiet. Inside the kennels, the dogs stirred slowly. It was late spring now, the air had grown thick with green, and the wild fields behind the shelter buzzed with insects and distant birdsong. The two dogs had been there for nearly 3 weeks. The younger one, still called Girl on her records, was stronger now, though she still moved with care. Her ribs had softened beneath new weight. Her eyes, once unfocused and dim, now followed movement with alertness. She did not bark, but she watched. The male, named Ash by one of the volunteers, had healed faster. His wounds had closed. His coat had begun to grow in fuller, darker at the spine, lighter along the jaw. When Staff came near, he stepped forward, not begging for attention, but present, steady. They shared a kennel, and always had. Each time someone opened the gate, they stood side by side. If one rose, the other did too. If one lay down, the other curled close, their backs touching, tails overlapping like vines. On visit days, people came slowly, locals mostly, some families, a few older couples. They walked past the rows of kennels holding umbrellas, pointing here and there, pausing at the loud barkers and the playful pups. Ash and Girl never barked. They stood silently, pressing together, their bodies calm even when footsteps passed. That morning, the woman arrived just before noon. She was middle-aged, in a long raincoat, holding her phone in one hand and a folded photograph in the other. Her shoes were muddy, like she'd walked through a field before coming. A staff member greeted her at the gate, and she spoke in low, urgent tones, asking about a pair of dogs, not puppies, not new arrivals, but older. lost together. The shelter worker paused, then nodded. Gestured down the main path toward the back kennels. The woman walked without looking at the others. Her hands trembled slightly. The photograph remained pressed against her palm. Her eyes scanned each kennel, each pair of eyes behind the fencing. And then she stopped. Her breath hitched. The photograph slipped slightly in her grip. "Oh my God," she whispered. The two dogs stood quietly inside. Ash was at the front, head tilted. Girl remained half curled on the bed, ears lifted. Their gaze held hers, unbroken. She raised her hand, not reaching out, just letting it hover above the gate. "It's them," she said softly. "It's really them." The staff member behind her watched in silence. "They went missing last fall," the woman continued, her voice shaking. "The storm, the flood came so fast. The river overflowed, washed out the bridge near our land. We searched for days. Everyone did. We thought they were gone." Ash stepped forward just one slow step and tilted his head again. The woman knelt then. She dropped the umbrella, let it roll off into the gravel. Her eyes brimmed with tears that spilled without sound. She looked smaller somehow, folded in grief and relief, both. Girl shifted on the bed, then rose. Her legs were stronger now, enough to carry her weight. She walked forward, slow but certain, and stopped beside Ash. Their tails touched again. The woman reached through the bars and rested her fingers there. Ash leaned forward, not licking, not whining, just pressing his nose gently against her hand. The connection wasn't sudden. It had always been there, buried beneath the months, beneath the rain and the hunger and the cold. It rose now like a tide, receding, revealing something once lost beneath silt. "I'd never stopped looking," the woman whispered. "Not really." Later, the man who had found them was called. He arrived by dusk. Boots still dirty from the pasture, a quiet smile tucked behind his weathered eyes. He stood beside the woman without saying much. Just looked into the kennel, where the two lay curled once again. This time, not in exhaustion, but in rest. Girl had eaten earlier that day. A full bowl, finished it all. Ash had let her eat first, then taken his portion. There was no more fear in their movements now, no more bracing for things to be taken. The adoption paperwork was simple. There were no fees, no interviews, just a confirmation. The microchip scan confirmed what the woman already knew in her bones. She didn't rush them. The kennel gate opened slowly. She sat on the floor, coat bunched around her knees, and waited. Ash came first. Girl followed. And when the three of them left the shelter together, the path behind them remained empty but not forgotten. It had taken months, a flood, a hollow in the woods, a stranger's quiet kindness. But now, under soft rain and greening skies, two lives once nearly lost were found again, together. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. They remembered.